Hi everybody, my name is Rogerio, and this is my presentation for ICRA 21 called Batteries, Cameras, Action, Learning Semantic Control Space for Expressive Robot Cinematography. And this is joint work between Carnegie Mellon and Facebook AI Research. Over the past few years, aerial cameras are revolutionizing the way we can record movies. But controlling a camera is an activity that is still very hard and involves changing several intuitive parameters related to the camera's velocities, angles, and distances in space. And the goal of this paper is to make aerial filming more intuitive for the human user. And to be more specific, we see several challenges in the deployment of manual cameras. For example, we usually have very unintuitive control interfaces between the user and the camera with the use of joysticks or keyboards that make it very hard for us to control the movements of this camera in space. And this often causes us to require multiple operators to control a single camera, which makes the system overly expensive. And one more factor that cannot be neglected and that plays a very important role in camera deployment is that it takes many years for a cinematographer or a director to master the art of filmmaking. And what we try to do in this work is to make the interface between the camera and the user more intuitive, so that instead of using a control interface such as a joystick, we want to be able to more specifically use semantic controls. So a user can directly tell a camera to make an exciting, calm, revealing clip, or use other adjectives that can express their true intent towards the task. So the way this works in practice is the user can interact with the camera by specifying commands before flight begins. For example, they can say something like they want to make a very exciting clip. These commands are then translated through our semantic interface to the camera that then executes them in real time. And here you can see a clip that was produced using our system that is trying to maximize the idea of excitement in the video. And mathematically, what we're trying to do is to learn a mapping between emotions and shot parameters and vice versa. So for every video in our data set, we have a series of shot parameters, which are basically features that describe the motion of our camera relative to the actor in the shot. So we have velocities, distances, and angles. And we try to learn a function f that maps these features towards a emotional descriptor vector that expresses how users that are watching the scene are going to feel when watching it. And we can also learn the inverse function f-1 that given a series of emotional descriptors of a scene, we find the shot parameters that best describe the camera motion that would produce such a scene emotionally for the users. And as you can imagine, one of the biggest challenges of what we're trying to do here is to obtain the emotional labels for each one of the videos in our dataset. And to do that, we use thousands of users in a crowdsourcing platform that watch those clips and they evaluate the emotional content of all the clips that they're watching. And to produce these videos in the first place, we use a photorealistic simulator, where we have a relatively neutral scene of an actor running over a suburban space. And in the simulator, we generate very realistic camera movements that take into account the drone's physics and also avoids collisions and occlusions that obstacles may generate on the image. And we use our previous work as the motion-based motion blending system to do these shots. We also base our shots on a series of canonical shots that are found in cinematography literature. And in some of them, we have a relative movement between the camera and the actor, and some of them always keep the same distance and angles between the camera and the actor at all times. And on top of these canonical shots, we produce several variations by changing the tilt angle, angular speeds, for example, as in the videos you see here, and many other parameters that are contained in the shot type. And to make sure that our dataset is sufficiently diverse, we run a first user study to try to identify the minimally perceptual changes that shot parameters cause in the videos that actually make them distinct from one another. For example, here you see two videos that have distinct tilt angles for the camera, and if the difference between the tilt angles is large enough, users can actually perceive these differences as being significant. And this is what we try to evaluate for a series of different parameters that you can see on the paper. And here you find the results of our first perceptual experiments. I know there's a lot of information, so feel free to pause this slide and take a more careful look at the numbers. But what you find here is on green, we have the preset shots that were the canonical shots I showed before. In blue, we have differences in shot parameters that are not statistically significant for being different than the preset shots. So let's say if we have a change in the angle of the camera that is not large enough, it's not going to be perceived as being a different shot overall. And in red, we find differences that are being perceived as being statistically significant. And that's the minimal perceptual change that we utilize to build our diverse data set. And by using these minimal perceptual changes, we built a significantly diverse video data set that we're going to use for our emotional labels. Once we have all the videos in hand, we have a special method for obtaining the emotional labels for each one of the videos. Instead of asking people on an absolute scale let's say, how exciting they find a clip, we actually have pairwise comparisons. And we do this because people are very bad at giving absolute scores for subjective quantities like labeling how exciting a movie is. And even if we did that, the order in which we show the movies would highly influence the results that we obtain in the data. So we use pairwise comparisons where each user watches a pair of videos and they have to tell us which movie is more exciting, the one on the left or the one on the right. And this type of experiment results in much better data that we use for evaluating the subjective quantities. And once we run the user study, we have to transform this data that was collected for pairwise clips into an absolute ranking of, let's say, how exciting each one of the movies was. In our data matrix, we have a series of games. So imagining we have n videos, we have at most n squared minus n games, where a game is defined as the comparison of one video against another. For each one of the games, we can have a variable number of matches. The match is like the actual question that we ask the user. We may have, for some of the videos, we may have more, for some we have less matches, for some we may even have none. But we have to transform all this relative data into an absolute ranking. And to do that, we use an algorithm called TrueSkill, which is very often used in the domain of games and entertainment, to update a belief over the mean and the variance of the emotional score for each one of the videos. And we iterate over several epochs until we reach convergence of the scores for each one of the videos. Once we have all the emotional scores for each one of the videos, we can also trace correlations between different emotions. Something we see, for example, are some patterns that show us that movies that are usually rated as being very exciting have a very high negative correlation with being calm, which is very intuitive for us. We also find patterns such as exciting movies are usually also rated as being very interesting. And we can do several other correlations in this table. And if we treat these correlations as being distances between points, we can also plot a 3D emotional feature space that tells us how these emotions are organized in space. And something that is interesting is that we find that our experimental data does match what we would expect in literature in psychology, where our emotions are organized in three main axes of arousal, valence, and dominance emotions. Another interesting insight from our data is that it is much easier to learn a mapping from shock parameters to emotions than it is to learn the inverse mapping from emotions to shock parameters. And the reason is that imagine you are trying to do a movie that is being rated as being very exciting. It is, we can find many different types of camera movements that produce a movie that is rated as exciting. However, if you begin with a particular camera movement and you do variations on top of this feature space, you're usually going to find very similar emotions. And that's why we have this one-to-one and one-to-many mapping, depending on the direction we're trying to go to. We also evaluate our models using the experimental data. So here you can see how we're predicting emotional scores from the features of the video. For the particular emotion of establishing, you can see how our predicted values in orange match the trend line of the crowdsourced values in gray. And we do this not only for one emotion, but for all the other emotions that we consider in this study. And it's very interesting to see that we are able to learn such a subjective quantity by using the models that we have trained. We also evaluate our models based on how we can generate shots that have particular degrees of emotional content. So here you can see for each one of the emotions, we are producing movies that vary from having the minimal content of that emotion to the maximum expression. And I'm going to let the video play again just so you can evaluate the shots once more. We could also have combinations of different emotions, but in this case, in these videos, we're only attaining to a single emotion at a time. And we also evaluate the trained model. And we also evaluate the trained model not only in the environment where it was trained, but we also deploy it in different environments. So here you can see how we're not only acting on that first simulated scene, but we also have a second simulated scene where the actor is playing soccer with a crowd cheering. And we also have videos that were produced in real-life conditions in unscripted applications. And finally, we have a final user study to evaluate how well this model that maps emotions to short parameters performs in those three different environments. And you can see that for different emotions, we can in fact achieve the expected degree of emotional content for each one of those particular emotions. We also collect additional shots, so here you see two more examples of unscripted scenes where we told our system to maximize how enjoyable these shots were. We have a person that is doing parkour and somebody else who is doing a dance. And here you can see a third-party perspective of how our system looks like in practice in a real-life environment. We have a soccer player that is dribbling the ball, and the drone is doing a shot from the right side that is changing the camera's pattern over time, going from the back to the front of the subject, trying to maximize how enjoyable this footage looks. And to conclude this presentation, I want to bring up a few key ideas related to the interaction between the camera and the human user. The first idea we saw here is that it can be quite useful to break down this complex camera motion behavior into a high level and a low level policy, the high level policy being trained using this intentional semantic user data, and the low level policy that uses traditional robotics pipelines to perform the camera motion. We also saw that to generate these emotional labels, it can be very useful to, first of all, generate a diverse video data set and then use crowdsourcing to obtain these labels, because ultimately it is a subjective quantity that has to be obtained directly from human data. And finally, we saw how we can learn a mapping between the camera emotions and the perceived video emotions, and how we can deploy and validate these ideas in not only simulated but also real-life environments. And looking into the future, I see many possible applications of this type of models in robotics. And even though this presentation was very much focused on aerial cameras and cinematography, I think that the same ideas of learning robot styles can be applicable to many other domains. Because for most robotics applications that we care about, we are not just trying to go from point A to point B, but in fact, we're trying to accommodate for several styles of the robot movement in space. Just to give two examples here, when you think of self-driving cars, the driving styles matters almost as much as just going from point A to point B as fast as possible. Now, we as humans are very quick at identifying if a driver is acting aggressively or being very conservative on the road. And the same idea applies to manipulation. If a robot is interacting very closely with a human, let's say trying to give them a cup of coffee, we're not just trying to go from the table to the person's mouth as quickly as possible to assist them, but in fact, we need to express these motions in a way that it's trustworthy and it's legible. And that's why I think that being able to express emotional content into the movement and motion features of robots is a very powerful technique. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions you might have over the Zoom session or via email. Thank you.